If you're willing to trust the input that you get from users, then I have a bridge in Brooklyn you might be interested in buying. However, if you don't trust that input, then you're here for the right episode. We're going to look at validating our user-supplied email addresses this week so that we can highlight Mongoose's data validation functionality. So here is our trusting user model from last week. It was really sweet in its naivete, but it's time for it to face the harsh realities of life on the internet. We want to tell it how to validate the input it receives. Mongoose does have some built-in validators. In fact, let's use one right now. We really need to have an email address for each user, and we signify that by adding the property required with key true to our email definition. Every schema type can make use of this required validator, not just strings. And here we are in the node REPL trying to make a user that violates this validation. Notice that it doesn't work, and also that the user was not created in Mongo, as we're doing in the lower right. The two records that exist were there from last week. Mongoose has a few other built-in validators, but they're pretty easy to use, so we won't spend any more time here on those. We will end up using the enumerator validator on string types in later episodes when we get into character creation. Our main focus for today is custom validators, for when those built-in ones just aren't enough. To use a custom validator, we hook into Mongoose's validation middleware flow. Mongoose has a pretty slick middleware system to it, just like how Express does, only Mongoose's doesn't deal with HTTP requests. Validation is simply a part of that middleware stack. To hook into the validation process, this is a simple declaration on our model. We just add the validate property to our schema and give it a function. That function takes a single parameter, which will be the value of the field we're validating. We're using a pretty restrictive email validator here, but our present goal is just to show the form of hooking it up. And now we can try to create a new user. We see that the creation failed and that we have an error object. That's a rather verbose error message. Could we give it something slightly more meaningful? If we switch the value of our validate key to an array, we can supply our own error message. The first element is the validation function, and the second element is the message we want to present when the validation fails. And we can have a look at this in the REPL too. Notice that the error message is a bit more meaningful now, and that it corresponds to what we supplied in our schema definition. Well, that is all well and good, but we have a pretty lousy email validator right now. Let's get a more robust one. It turns out there's a nice package that supplies us with a number of useful validation functions, including one for emails. It's called Mongoose Validate, and I link to its page in the show notes. To wire this up, we first require the module, just like we would any other. And then we remove our dummy email validator and replace the reference to it with the email function attached to Mongoose Validate. We can try out our new validator in the REPL, and we see that it's behaving as we expect. We can even open up our database in MongoDB directly and see that our user is there now. So, is this a perfect email validator? I don't know. You'd have to define perfect. If you mean every email that the spec allows, then this likely isn't a perfect validator. But it's good enough for our purposes and will likely include a large enough set of users that it won't hinder our project. It turns out that validating email addresses is hard business, and I invite you to read all about it in the hacked.com article linked in the show notes. But if we're fine with that limitation, then we can at least rest assured knowing that if we try to change the email address of a valid user, we'll see that the validation kicks in again, preventing us from doing something bad to our data. Just for some warm fuzzies, let's show ourselves that the error does indeed make it through to our route handler by trying to create a user with an invalid email in the browser. And then we can also see that we haven't affected the form when a valid email is supplied. And if we pop back into Mongo, we can see that the data reflects what we entered into our form. So in closing, here's one that threw me for a loop when I first learned it, especially having come to Node from Ruby on Rails. Mongoose model instances have an update function in which you pass an object containing the properties you want the instance to be updated to. This update function on a model does not pass through the validation middleware. It's a call that goes directly down to MongoDB, which you can note from the very different signature on the callback. Note that despite our validation, the database still has the invalid value. This doesn't mean that you should never use update, just be aware of how it works. And also, this isn't a limitation. I don't actually like the design of having the model have validation logic, as personally I believe that belongs elsewhere, but that will be a topic for another episode. And speaking of another episode, we're going to call it quits for today. Stay tuned for next week when we talk about Mongoose virtuals, middleware, and instance methods. Until then, happy coding. If you've been watching the episodes and want to add any comments or questions about them, don't forget that each episode has a comments tab where you can say something. And also, the site has a feedback where you can find contact information. So if you think I'm talking too much, or maybe there are just some other topics that you want to see covered, let me know. Thanks for watching.